So, Chapter 16 of Boruto's Two Blue Vortex is officially out. Well, at least for me, a guy who reads a Turkish guide translated from Japanese to English. What a silly place the internet is. And while I will admit Chapter 16 is definitely a setup chapter, that was kind of to be expected. I mean, after all, in Chapter 15, it was literally just established that not only is there now another Shinju, but that Shinju is Shinki. And therefore, we knew, not only from the official leaks coming from Boruto, but also from our reason-driven brains, that most likely the location that Two Blue Vortex was going to be taking place in for the next couple of chapters would be the Land of Wind, or the Hidden Sand Village. And while it's been a long time since we had to watch ninjas hop all the way to another country, it makes sense that if the location of the manga is swapping countries, then we're probably going to be doing that for the entire chapter. But pulling up in the Land of Wind isn't all that was accomplished in Chapter 16. We got exposition on not only how Boruto's flying Raijin jutsu works, but also on how Kashin Koji's 10 paths work. On top of this, the chapter was surprisingly Ada heavy, as her allegiance appears to be hanging in the balance between Boruto, Kawaki, or maybe just the world. We saw a rift begin to grow over Sarada and Sumire as debates about whether or not Boruto's gonna end up with Sarada or Sumire are now heating up in all of my comment sections. And yes, maybe more importantly than anything, we saw Team 7 pull up in the Land of Wind. And maybe more importantly than that, Team 7 is not alone there. See, because not only are Matsuri and Ryu in the Land of Wind as well, but also there's a fair shot Boruto's there. Or at least he soon will be. Which means in the next couple of chapters, we should see undoubtedly the most important fight in Two Blue Vortex up until this point. But how did all of these events fall into place, and what do they mean for the future of Boruto? Well, we're gonna talk about all that and more today, guys, because today we're talking Chapter 16 of Two Blue Vortex Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking at my shirt and thinking, wow, that's a really cool shirt, you're right, it is. And it's also for sale now in my fourth wall link below. This is a new t-shirt in my NCH Archive streetwear merch collection. But before we get into all that today, we're gonna talk about our favorite recurring sponsor to the page, BetterHelp. Listen, the stress of running 4 pages has been getting to me recently, and I had begun a dangerous cycle of conflating my worth with the success of those 4 pages. If things weren't going well on an individual page, I found it hard to get out of bed. I found it hard to find motivations to do things. I stopped working out. I stopped eating well. And it's at that point that I realized that I need to get into therapy. And that's where BetterHelp came into play. See, not only did BetterHelp make finding a therapist incredibly easy, as all I had to do was fill out an incredibly simple questionnaire telling BetterHelp what was going on with me and what I was looking for in a therapist, and then within 48 hours, I was connected with a licensed therapist. And BetterHelp claims that the vast majority of people who come to their website and fill out their questionnaire will be connected with a therapist within that 48-hour time frame. Now, my therapist has helped me establish ways to reinforce the parts of my life that aren't touched by work, which has allowed me to work on my appreciation for the things and people around me that I love and I am loved by. And I've worked with my therapist to trust myself more and allow that trust to free up time in my life to spend the time with the things and people who matter. So what are you waiting for? Don't wait until it's too late. If you're struggling and think you would benefit from a session of therapy, click the link in my description or go to betterhelp.com/nchammer and get 10% off your first month of therapy. There's no such thing as a bad time to take care of what's upstairs. So, did Chapter 16 start off where Chapter 15 left off? God, no. Chapter 16 of Two Blue Vortex starts off long before the ending of Chapter 15. Because Chapter 16 of Two Blue Vortex starts with a flashback of Kashin Koji and Boruto talking about space-time ninjutsu. See, on this first page, Kashin Koji is explaining to Boruto that space-time ninjutsu immediately transfers anybody or any object to a specified location. And that space-time ninjutsu, much like flying, is one of the base set jutsus for the Otsutsuki. And this is true, but not necessarily in the way that Kashin Koji explained it. Yes, Yamata Hirasaka is said to be one of the core jutsus of the Otsutsuki. And while that is technically a space-time ninjutsu, it's more about opening portals than actually teleporting to individual places. Space-time ninjutsu is kind of a catch-all term. I mean, summoning jutsus are space-time ninjutsu. But yes, technically Boruto as a full-blooded Otsutsuki should have a proclivity for space-time ninjutsu. Kashin Koji continues on by saying, you've manifested this ability multiple times in the past, mostly in reference to when Boruto uses his karma marking to open up portals. And while Boruto has used his Jogan to use space-time ninjutsu in the anime, that's never been seen in the manga. Now, Kashin Koji goes on to say, all of these instances when you've used space-time ninjutsu prior to this were outbursts. That is to say that they can't be reproduced, and therefore you have no control over space-time ninjutsu. But, and this is where this conversation begins to get interesting. Kashin Koji says, in 6 years, you master this power. Now, this is interesting for a multitude of reasons, but the reason that it's most interesting to me is because while we knew that Boruto learned Rasengan Uzuhiko because he learned it in the future, we didn't know that he learned his Flying Raijin because he learned it in the future. This means that basically everything Boruto learned post-time skip came from Kashin Koji and his future self, which kind of puts into perspective just how powerful Boruto was with Sasuke versus with Kashin Koji. Kashin Koji then goes on to elaborate the space-time ninjutsu that Boruto masters, and this will explain why I've been saying Flying Raijin in quotations this entire video. Kashin Koji explains to Boruto that in 6 years' time, Boruto figures out how to give chakra to a ninja tool and then use space-time ninjutsu to teleport to said ninja tools. Kashin Koji then goes on to explain to Boruto that Boruto then calls this technique Flying Thunder God, explaining to Boruto that his grandfather used a very similar technique, though not the same technique. See, Flying Thunder God, as Minato and Tobirama uses, is really just a summoning contract with yourself. By placing a summoning seal on a weapon, a tree, or a human, at any point you're able to identify that summoning seal and summon yourself to that summoning seal instantaneously. However, Kashin Koji elaborates for Boruto that that is not how his technique works, because Boruto's Flying Thunder God doesn't use summoning seals, and it also can't necessarily be placed on humans or objects, just ninja tools. And therefore, Boruto, by imbuing his chakra into a ninja tool, is able to identify that chakra from far distances away and instantly transport himself to it. Now, this is something that we've been talking about for a long time, because for the entirety of Two Blue Vortex, it appears as though Boruto had only been teleporting to either the toads with the shapes or his own weapons. And thus we formulated the idea that either it's really hard for Boruto to place Flying Raijin seals, or he can only jump to the things that he's previously marked. And in both those capacities, we were basically half right. This establishes to us that Boruto's Flying Raijin is not only different from his grandfather's, but also inherently worse. Still useful, incredibly useful, but worse. Kashin Koji continues to elaborate that it took Boruto 6 whole years in the future timeline that he's stealing from to eventually figure out that the most optimal thing to funnel his chakra into were ninja tools. And thus Boruto, after hearing that ninja tools were the only thing he could teleport to, asked Kashin Koji, ninja tools, does this sword count? Pointing to Sasuke's sword. To which Kashin Koji says, yes, any sort of ninja tool will serve as a medium for transportation. He then goes on to elaborate just how much weaker Boruto's version of Flying Raijin is than Minato's. As he goes on to tell Boruto, if the ninja tool in question is visible and within range, teleportation will become much easier and more accurate, which makes Boruto realize that if an object was excessively far away from him, that it might be hard to teleport to it. At least that's what Kashin Koji seems to be telling him, which, as we all know, is something that was established in the early parts of Two Blue Vortex, because after Boruto snuck a toad on Code and Code jumped through dimensions to go to the Kara hideout, it took Boruto a second to triangulate where Code was, and that's the point where he said he wasn't as good as Minato at Flying Raijin. Now that made some of the more hysterical and insane Boruto fans believe that possibly Boruto trained with Minato during the time skip. But in actuality, what Boruto was telling us is that his Flying Raijin technique is just inherently worse than Minato's. And the reason he knows that is because at some point he knew that, and therefore Kashin Koji knows it. But why is it so hard to teleport long distances? Well, Kashin Koji tells Boruto, let's assume that you've assigned chakra to 2 shuriken, and those shuriken are far north and far south of you. You, using your space-time ninjutsu ability, will reach out for the medium of chakra you identify as a shuriken. However, because there's 2 of them, there's really no knowing which shuriken you will jump to. That is to say that the more similar objects that Boruto is using as a medium for teleportation that he cannot see, the higher chance he jumps to the wrong one. Unless, of course, they were in different shapes, which, as we now know, is why Boruto wears so many pins. See, a couple of months ago, we talked about Boruto's design, and we saw that he wore a bunch of different pins. Now, every single one of the pins seems to draw back to a character in his life that he loves, and that conclusion alone was enough for us. However, in the moment that Kashin Koji is explaining that the way that Boruto got around figuring out how to teleport long distances was using different shaped pieces of metal or ninja tools, we see that all the shapes that Boruto has been using are also the pins that he's been wearing. And this coincides with basically every time we've ever seen Boruto teleport a long distance, as usually his teleportation boils down to a toad holding a shape of sorts, and then Boruto is told what shape to teleport to. And because each and every single one of these shapes is unique, Boruto never gets confused as to where he's going. But that does bring us back to an original theory we talked about in the character design video, where we touched on the idea that Boruto was going to give one of these pins to each of the people he loves, and they would be marked with a Flying Raijin seal of sorts that would allow for him to jump to them at any given moment. And now that we know why Boruto is wearing these pins and how Boruto's flying Raijin technique works, that seems even more likely. Now Boruto goes, oh, okay, so they're for different shapes. It makes it easier to differentiate where I'm jumping from far distances. And Kashin Koji is like, yeah, good job. And it's at this point that Kashin Koji needs to level with Boruto at least a little bit, as he tells him, listen, Boruto, the original timeline had you creating this jutsu over the course of 6 years. However, now you have the knowledge of 6 years of training over the course of mere minutes. But knowledge is just knowledge. It's still going to take an extraordinary amount of time for you to reach the level of expertise with flying Raijin that you reached in the original timeline. And Boruto in this moment teleports to a shuriken he has in the tree above and says, I know. Let's keep training. There's so much to learn. And that's kind of the Boruto experience. Everyone's always complaining that, oh, Boruto got too powerful too quick. We didn't get to see his process. But that's just kind of how a time skip works. Like, a good time skip has the characters coming back way more powerful, and then you're like, oh my god, what happened? And then over the course of the next upcoming chapters, you figure out exactly what happened. Why did Boruto come back with flying Raijin? The 10 paths. He also had to train like hell for a couple of years to master it. Why did he come back with Rasengan Uzuhiko? The 10 paths in training. Tie that into the fact that he was a genius who was able to add lightning to a Rasengan accidentally when his grandfather and the 6th Hokage couldn't pull it off after years of trying. And yeah, the boy's gonna get strong quick. We then cut to Kashin Koji and Boruto back in their abandoned Orochimaru lair, where Kashin Koji and Boruto are no longer talking about Boruto's techniques, but rather Kashin Koji's. And Boruto is asking Kashin Koji questions about the 10 paths, asking if you can see all possible futures, why wouldn't we tell everybody about the ability to see the futures, get their cooperations, and guarantee that the best possible future happens? And it's at this point that we get the exposition on the 10 paths and find out that it's basically the weakest form of future sight. That is to say, Kashin Koji tells us that it's ironically frustrating. The more people who know about the future, the more the future will change. That is to say, the Kashin Koji's future sight doesn't work like Yahaba's almighty, in that he's not able to choose a future he wants to see. He can move in a way that he believes will direct humanity towards a future he wants, but if everybody starts deviating from the course because they know what the future holds, then an entirely new future will be made. However, because Kashin Koji has this ability, he will always know the future. And just him knowing the future causes for the future timelines to branch out almost exponentially. And therefore, the sheer ability to see all possible futures is almost meaningless. Because at the end of the day, while future sight can give you some tidbits of information about the future, like if an event continually happens in the majority of future timelines, at the end of the day, it's really no different from guesstimating what the future is going to look like. And this is kind of what Kashin Koji says. He says, listen, knowing the future for better or worse is kind of just like drawing the future. While he might have an idea of what is to come, a well-informed person also has a pretty good idea of what is to come. The more people that know about the future, the harder it is to predict. See, because if somebody knows about the future, they deviate from the rail of destiny. Kashin Koji refers to these people as a heretical force that destabilizes the future, or a singularity. And therefore, Kashin Koji establishes that in order to advance humanity to the best possible future, it's a good idea to keep the amount of singularities to a bare minimum. And therefore, Kashin Koji and Boruto's roles as the singularities of destiny is to guide humanity towards its best possible outcome from the shadows, which is why Boruto has purposely left Sarada, Mitsuki, Sumire, and everybody else at an arm's length. It's why he hasn't described what he's up to. It's why he hasn't told anybody about his future sight abilities. Because if he were to do that and tell Sarada, Sumire, and Mitsuki things that they wouldn't know otherwise unless they knew the future, they would deviate from the path of their destiny, making it almost impossible for Boruto and Kashin Koji to predict what's coming. But Boruto and Kashin Koji are not the only singularities. See, because while Kashin Koji is informing Boruto that Boruto is a singularity, he also says out loud, sooner or later, Ada's gonna watch back our information. And thus Ada, whose Senrigan allows her to see anything that happens anywhere on Earth from the moment of her birth, was guaranteed to be privy to the conversation between Kashin Koji and Boruto about the multiple futures, and therefore herself become a singularity of fate. Now, technically, should Ada have been peeking on Boruto's location? No. Not really. Ada made a promise to Boruto at the end of part 1 that regardless of how hard she's pestered by the likes of Kawaki or Konoha, that she would never use her Senrigan to find him. That is, so long as he stayed away from Konoha. But now that Boruto has come back to Konoha in part 2, it seems as though that agreement is null and void, which is why Ada appears to currently be using the Senrigan to flip through what Boruto is up to during the time skip, which eventually made her privy to the 10 paths conversation, making her a singularity of fate. However, when Ada finally realizes that she is now a singularity of fate, she, with a shocked expression expression on her face, kind of awakes from using her Senrigan, and we see that Sarada and Sumire are sitting in her living room with her, presumably after hearing the news that Boruto had managed to break out of prison. Now, it appears as though Sarada and Sumire had actually asked Ada to use her Senrigan to peek into the time skip period when Boruto was away from the village, because Sarada, after seeing Ada snap back to reality, says, "Ada, what'd you figure out?" Now, it's this point that Ada hits a moral coin toss, because if Ada explains to Sarada and Sumire what she just saw, then they would also become singularities. And Ada, who wants to be assisting Boruto the best she can, but is also best friends with Sarada and Sumire and also wants to be helping them, is put in a weird kind of situation where she doesn't know whether or not she should tell her best friends about what she saw or keep Boruto's secret a secret. But she does decide to keep Boruto's secret a secret. Saying that the reason that Boruto didn't talk that much is because he has his own reasons. He specifically didn't talk to you guys to avoid unnecessary harm coming to you, and therefore his avoidance of you has been deliberate. Now, Sumire seems kind of taken aback by this, but Sarada seems offended. See, Sarada doesn't want Boruto carrying the weight of all this responsibility on his shoulders by himself. See, Sarada believes since she's on Boruto's side, she should step in to assist him, and therefore she asks Ada where Boruto is right now. Now, before Ada can answer this question, Sumire steps in and says, Sarada, telling Sarada that I believe Boruto doesn't want to be found right now. She goes on by saying, we are openly in support of Boruto in Konoha, even though we don't have that much information about him. But she goes on to say that that's an advantage. Because they don't have that information about Boruto, they're able to operate as they usually would. They're able to operate in Konoha under the assumption that Boruto's out there doing good in full support of him in Konoha. Now, this catches Sarada off guard. She goes, Sumire? But Sumire continues with her fairly good points by saying that what I believe we should be doing right now is not chasing after Boruto. Now, Sarada, who's also coming from a place of reason here, says, but you saw Boruto when he was here. He almost got himself killed. Not only did he almost get killed by Jura, but also he got abducted by Konoha and locked in prison. And this is what I find so interesting about Sarada and Sumire having this pseudo-argument. Neither of them are necessarily wrong. Sumire is more buying into the idea of what Boruto would want them to do, and Boruto wouldn't want them to come to him. That's why he's been actively avoiding them and operating from the shadows. But Sarada sees how much weight Boruto has taken onto himself and wants to alleviate some of that weight from his shoulders. Now, Sarada continues by making her point by saying that the idea of Boruto going up against those Shinjus by himself is just too reckless and that he could have died. But Sumire retorts his point by saying, but we also could have died. Now, this catches Sarada way off guard because her own death isn't something that she's even contemplated. But Sumire, who realizes that she might be in the lead here in the argument a little bit, says, what if you think about it, even for a little bit? Boruto's feelings. Do you think that Boruto keeps everybody at an arm's length and doesn't talk to anybody is from a place of want? I know there's things you want to talk to Boruto about. Don't you think it's the same for him? That bitterness, that desire? But it's at this point that Sumire sticks a big old stick in the spokes of her own bike because, my God, she was cooking. But then she makes it about herself. See, because it's at this point that it's established why Sumire is actually upset with Sarada and why Sumire started on this path of talking about Boruto's feelings. Because remember a couple of chapters ago when Sarada hugged Boruto all real big in front of Sumire and we're all like, oh, Sumire the cock. Yeah, apparently she felt like that too. Because Sumire says, you haven't even stopped to consider Boruto's feelings, nor mine. Sumire goes on to tell Sarada, you know that I like Boruto, and yet you were the first one to jump in and say it. And it's at this point that we get a flashback of Sarada hugging Boruto all big, and a flashback of Sumire just standing there and letting it happen. Now, as to what Sarada said when she hugged him, I don't know why Sumire so hung up on that. I mean, all she said was, you're late, stupid Boruto. I don't necessarily know why Sumire would be jealous of that, but maybe it was more the hug. Now, Sumire goes on to say, I understand how you felt in that moment and why you were so excited to see Boruto and why you ran up and hugged him, but in that moment, did you even consider how I felt? And it's like, hey, Sumire, no, obviously not. He's been gone for 3 years. You think she's worried about how you're feeling? She's gonna give her, well, I guess, possibly future husband a hug. But that being said, man, if we could be so real here, quick side note. Pre this chapter, I felt as though with 100% certainty that Sarada and Boruto were gonna end up together. But now after this chapter, I don't know, this feels as though the closest this race has ever been. Like, yeah, we knew Sarada and Sumire liked Boruto. We've known that forever. But like an admission of feelings at this level and spending like half a chapter talking about Sumire's feelings about Boruto makes it feel as though the race might be kind of tight. Anyways, this speech makes everybody in the room feel super awkward as both Sarada and Ada sit there in stunned silence. And so, since nobody else picks up the conversational slack, Sumire says, well, and no one's ever let me talk this long, so I guess I'll keep going. As she continues on by saying, I'm sorry, it shouldn't be like this. The situation should not be like this. And like me from a bad date when things get awkward, Sumire goes, well, all right, and sprints out the door. And Kimoto gives us an upskirt of a 16-year-old. So, We could have avoided that one there, Chief. But as Sumire sprints from this bad date without paying the check, Sarada from behind her yells, "Wait! Class rep!" Which makes Sumire stop in her tracks, and without looking back at Sarada, she says, "How long are you gonna call me class rep?" And like, honestly, fair point. Even Boruto called Sumire class rep. Like, she's not just the class rep. You guys aren't even in class anymore. She's more than her title, you assholes. Her name's Sumire. This level of vitriolic hate towards being called class rep isn't totally coming from the fact that for the majority of my time in high school, I was called Nick Connor, even though there was like no other Nicks. And I was like, why is everyone using my last name? Oh yeah, and then they also called me Anyways, before Sarada and Ada have to do the awkward, "Oh, well, I guess they'll get going now too" conversation that you have when your friend introduces you to a friend of theirs and then your friend leaves, Shikamaru gives Ada a brain telephone call, saying, "Hey, it's Shikamaru. I need to ask you about something. We need to meet up." But before we move on with that plot line, were you curious about what the elders and the fire daimyo were doing? You weren't? Yeah, that's gonna make this next page awkward, because on the next page, we see the fire daimyo having a FaceTime call with the two elders. And honestly, the sheer fact that the two elders were able to figure out how to do a FaceTime call with somebody else might prove that they actually do deserve a governmental position. Now, at this point in time, the two elders are getting scolded by the daimyo. As the fire daimyo says to the two elders, letting somebody escape after capturing them is a bad look for Konoha, and that a rogue shinobi or two should be no issue for the strongest nation on Earth. Now, Kohaku, the female of the two elders, says, "Sincerely, we have no excuses to justify this." To which the fire daimyo responds by saying, "Catch him and kill him, and if you don't, the appropriate person will have to take punishment for this." Presumably, the appropriate person to take the repercussion of not being able to catch Boruto here would either be the two elders or Shikamaru. But Hamura, the male of the two elders, assures the fire daimyo that Boruto will be caught. And after that, we cut back to Ada and Shikamaru. Why did we need to know what they were up to? I don't really know. It didn't really establish anything different. We knew the daimyo wanted Boruto dead. We know the elders wants Boruto dead. I don't know why we needed to do it again. But whatever. We see that Shikamaru and Ada are meeting somewhere, presumably on Ada's porch, which seems to be the most important place in Konoha nowadays. And as Shikamaru walks up to Ada, he says that he'd rather not meet her face to face, because whenever he sees her face, his mind slows down, which, you know, I don't love to hear from a married man, but then again, she does have an omnipotence charm shinjutsu that makes everybody that she sees fall in love with her. Now, it's this point that Ada says, "Well, yeah, but you also don't want to be heard by the sensory team. And also, when you get out of sorts like this, it's kind of cute and I like it." She is 18 post time skip. I'm a Tamari fan personally, but whatever. The more important thing here is that Shikamaru is meeting with Ada in secret, so that the compromised sensory team, led by Ino, who clearly told Shikamaru that she wasn't on his side and his assistant Boruto, wouldn't be able to listen into the mental conversation that they were having. Because, mind you, the only reason they were having a mental conversation is because of the sensory unit. Now, at this point, Shikamaru, who is clearly flustered, says, "So what's the situation in the hidden sand?" And it's this point that Ada gives Shikamaru the bad news. That a new Shinju has been born, and at its core is Shinki. And this new Shinju's target is the Kazekage, Gaara. She also lets Shikamaru know that Gaara is currently sealed inside of a Fuinjutsu created by Shinki. However, Ryu, who is the Shinju of Shinki, would be able to undo the Fuinjutsu. Now, Shikamaru, who just heard that his brother-in-law, who also happens to be the Kazekage, is in a serious amount of danger, says to Ada that he'll arrange a rescue mission immediately. Now, to this point, that Ada lets him know that immediately is a pretty good idea because she saw this happen a couple of hours ago. As she now, after Bug was able to see her while she was using her Senrigan ability on the Shinju, doesn't use her Senrigan ability on the motions of the Shinju in real time, because she doesn't want to be peered at the way that the Bug Shinju peered at her when she used her Senrigan on the Shinju in real time. So Ada tells Shikamaru that's just the way it is. I apologize that you aren't going to be able to get news on the Shinju in real time. I feel bad and I'm sorry. But Shikamaru says, "Got it. You're totally fine. I just appreciate you giving me this information in the first place." Now, Ada, in response to that, changes the topic of the conversation to Boruto and says, "You've stopped trying to kill Boruto. You even used Mitsuki to allow for Boruto to escape." Now, in response to this, Shikamaru quite literally pleads the fifth and says, "I don't know what you're talking about," but Ada sees through it immediately and says that he's feigning ignorance. However, the crazy part about omnipotence is that Shikamaru may not actually be feigning ignorance here. I mean, it was already established in the last couple of chapters that Shikamaru's ability to see through omnipotence is already fading on him, but in actuality, he is probably feigning ignorance. But Ada says, "Don't worry, I'm not gonna snitch on you. In fact, it would be inconvenient for me if your position was compromised." That, and she doesn't want to create any problems for Boruto. Now, this catches Shikamaru's attention, but it appears as though Ada is is beginning to fall for Boruto. Because not only when she said all this was she having a flashback of when Boruto told Sarada, Sumire, and Ada that he didn't want to talk to any of them, but she also referred to him as Boruto-kun. See, because Ada and Ada alone understands when Boruto said he didn't want to talk to Sarada and Sumire and Ada, he wasn't saying that because he meant it, but rather because he was trying to protect them, which may be a level of chivalry that Ada is attracted to. I don't know. She is, after all, still pursuing Kawaki. I will say, though, 3 love interest is my hard cap for an IP I can be interested in, and that hard cap was established by Black Clover, Mimosa, Noelle, and the waitress. That's it. So yeah, Sarada, Sumire, and maybe Ada can be interested in Boruto, but if you add even one more, I'm out. I'm too old for harems. Ada then goes on to continue informing Shikamaru in her snitch sesh that Kawaki also agreed to cooperate with Boruto for the time being, and therefore if your goal is to kill the humanoid Shinju, then it's probably best to stay out of Kawaki and Boruto's way. Now Shikamaru doesn't respond to this, but he does ask Ada a question, saying, Ada, Boruto has a secret collaborator. Did you see him? Referring to Kashin Koji. Shikamaru goes on to say, the last time he talked to me, he did it through the medium of a frog, and I'd seen that frog before. And therefore Shikamaru comes to the conclusion that Boruto's collaborator is Kashin Koji. Now, fortunately for Shikamaru, Ada's got multiple allegiances, or she just got like really humid and swampy hair because out of her hair climbs one of Kashin Koji's toads. And the toad tells Shikamaru, good guess, Shikamaru, it's as you say. So let me tell you the gist of it. And you're not allowed to ask any questions, which I don't know, is kind of weird. It's not like there's a time limit on how long Kashin Koji can talk through this toad. But that being said, the more Shikamaru knows, the higher chance it becomes a singularity, so I guess that's fair. But at this point, the Kashin Koji tells Shikamaru to dispatch Sarada, Mitsuki, and Konohamaru to the Land of Wind right now. He then goes on to say that Ryu, Matsuri, or both of them could show up there, and that the 3 ninjas that he dispatches will work together with 2 ninjas from the Land of Wind, presumably to take on Ryu and Matsuri. Now Shikamaru, who forgot literally the only rule to this conversation, says, hold on, I'm gonna need a good reason to do that. Tell me why I should go along with this. Kashin Koji goes, I thought you were like the most intelligent guy of all time. You're telling me you can't listen to rules? And then he says, if Mitsuki, Sarada, or Konohamaru say that they don't want to go to the Hidden Wind, give them a plausible reason to go. Make something up if you need to. Oh yeah, and while I got you here, don't let Himawari leave Konoha. She's being targeted by Jura, but for some reason, Jura really likes Konoha and believes that it's worth preserving for like architectural and cultural reasons. But if Himawari at any point leaves Konoha, Jura's gonna target her and kill her. And therefore, so long as nothing catastrophic happens, Himawari should actually be safe inside of Konoha because Jura understands a battle inside of Konoha could destroy it. And that is a really interesting little tidbit of information. Oh, why, you ask? Because we know Konoha gets destroyed, which means that there's like a 99.99% chance that it's not Jura who does it. But then who destroys Konoha? How does it happen? And what does it have to do with Jura, Kawaki, and Himawari? Well, we're going to be answering all those questions and a whole lot more in our next video on this channel, so make sure you hit that noti bell while you got a chance. Kashin Koji then continues by saying, oh yeah, and if Jura goes to a bookstore, can you inform all of the bookstores in Konoha to treat him like their #1 customer? Like, can you imagine the Hokage going from bookstore to bookstore, pulling owners and being like, hey, if this shirtless, hooved monstrosity happens to wander into your store, make sure you bring him some tea. This obviously catches Shikamaru way off guard because he doesn't want to go to all the bookstores in Konoha. There's probably a ton. But Kashin Koji goes on to say something very interesting, which is that this guy is not a joke. He's insanely powerful, and the most important thing we can do right now is not attack him. If he were to get serious, our chances of victory are 1 in a million. And mind you, this is Kashin Koji saying this, which means that Kashin Koji has probably seen a million universes where Jura gets serious and only one where humanity comes out alive. Now, mind you, this is also Kashin Koji saying this, the person who knows exactly how strong Boruto is. And yet Kashin Koji is saying, even if we had all of our ducks in line, if Jura gets serious, we are not winning, which means that Jura is way more powerful than we even begun to speculate. I mean, yeah, he cut off Code's hand almost effortlessly last chapter, but Code has been beaten up by everybody. If Kashin Koji believes that the combined forces of Earth, Boruto included, cannot defeat Jura, that is insane. And it poses some very interesting and logistical questions like, how is Jura so powerful? Interesting and logistical questions that we're also going to be answering this week, so make sure you hit the noti button. But like, not in this video, because this video is already long. Anyways, Kashin Koji says, don't interfere with Jura. We'll take out his allies with as small a force as possible, but if he pulls up, pull out, which seems to imply that there is a massive discrepancy in power between Jura and his allies. If a combined force of Ayara, Yodo, Konohamaru, Sarada, and Mitsuki is enough to take on Matsuri and Ryu simultaneously, but if the entire combined forces of all of humanity has a 1 in a million shot of defeating Jura, that is a huge difference in power. Anyways, at this point, Kashin Koji says, "That's all from me," and then jumps out of Ada's hair. Before he quite literally hops off into the sunset, he looks back at Shikamaru and says, "For aiding Boruto's escape from prison, I begrudgingly admit that I am thankful. Despite the fact that there was no guarantees, you went against the rules of the ninja world and put your life on the line for him. For the sake of what you believed was right, I will not force you to do anything. For the sake of the future, follow your heart." And then he hopped away, hoppy, till the very next day. But we actually don't know what happened in the next day. The entire chapter takes place in one day, but you get it. This whole conversation stresses Shikamaru out to the point where he decides to light up a cigarette in front of a girl barely old enough to smoke them and lets out a good old signature, "What a pain." Now, Ada starts to think on the words, "follow your heart." And while thinking on those words, Sumire pops up, and she appears to be crying by herself somewhere off in her laboratory, asking herself the question of why she decided to call out Sarada like that. Now, I don't really know what any of this means. I don't know why Ada is thinking of Sumire. I don't know why we're putting such a focus on Sumire here, but the fact that like a quarter to a third of this chapter is focused around Sumire and her love for Boruto, but also her respecting of his wishes, makes me feel like in the next couple of chapters, she's going to take a step up in terms of importance, either in power or plot relevance. But as currently stands, I have no answers for any of it. If you guys have any predictions on what's going on with Sumire or what we could see from her in the future, let me know in the comments below. Anyways, enough about Sumire's useless ass, because on the next page, we got the hardest manga panel we've ever gotten in all of Boruto, and somehow it includes Konohamaru. Because on the next page, we see that Mitsuki, Sarada, and Konohamaru have made it to the Land of Wind. And Sarada is not only in her new outfit, but is also wearing her headband like her mother wears her headband, and it looks sick. Her new design is so dope, dude. I love it so much. Mitsuki is also in the back, dripped the hell out, also wearing his headband. And Konohamaru, always wears his headband. So, he's there as well. Mostly Sarada's pulling this panel together. And now on the next page, we see Mitsuki walk up to Sarada and ask her what's going on, because apparently she's zoning out. Presumably, Sarada is also thinking about Sumire in the same way that Ada was thinking about Sumire. But Konohamaru tells her to lock in because otherwise the sand ninja will laugh at them. And it's at that point exactly that Yodo and Ayara pull up. And this is the first page that we got from the official leaks from the Boruto account. Ayara saying, "Thanks for coming to the Wind. We count on your support." And Konohamaru saying, "The feeling is mutual. Let's get going." A detail that I didn't talk about when we did our breakdown of this panel a couple of days ago is the fact that Ikimoto decided to give Ayara a whale tail, which is, it's a choice for a 16-year-old. And to the kids who don't understand what a whale tail is, I'd have to explain what Y2K and opium core clothing designs were in the early 2000s and how they're resurging right now in streetwear, and how streetwear is actually hugely prevalent in Japan, and Ikimoto's establishing a lot of that streetwear culture into his character designs now, but it's still a weird choice for a 16-year-old, but like, you know enough. Anyways, this cross-nation coalition link up and begin to head out towards Gaara's last known location. And we see the 5 of them laying out on a cliff looking out over a desert. As Konohamaru says, the coordinates that we got show that the location we're looking for should be in those column-shaped rocks. But after hearing this, Mitsuki asks Konohamaru where did the 8th get this information, to which Konohamaru responds by saying, "I'm not sure, but it's the best that we got." And at this point, that AR decides that it's a good time to check in with Sarada for some reason, saying, "Yo, long time no see. Your vibe has changed quite a bit. And I'll tell you right now, seeing the word vibe in the Boruto manga threw me off. It's something major." Ayara then follows this up by asking Sarada if she's taken a liking to a guy, and that's why her vibe has changed. And this throws Sarada way off as she goes, that's not. But Ayara cuts her off before she gets the chance to answer and goes, "I see. Not that it really matters to me anyways." And here's the thing. Not only are none of the women in this chapter passing the Bechdel test, if you ask a woman a question as to why her vibe has changed and don't give her the opportunity to answer, that's just rude. Why don't you ask Mitsuki why his vibe has changed? He wasn't wearing long black robes the last time you saw him. But anyways, before we can spend the 20th page of this chapter talking about boys, Konohamaru with a pair of binoculars says, "There they are. The Shinju." And it's at this point that we see that both Matsuri and Ryu are staring at something on the ground. And that something happens to be a frog that looks as though it may be dead. But considering the fact that the toads used by Kashin Koji are scientific ninja tools created by Amado, and that when they get hit hard enough, they just poof back to Kashin Koji, it's hard to believe that this toad is actually dead. But while they're staring down at this toad, pondering what's going on with it, Konohamaru says, "Damn it, 2 of them showed up." And we see with the final panel of chapter 16, Mitsuri and Ryu saying, "It's a clue that will tie us to Boruto." And that's interesting, because outside of the idea that Kashin Koji had somehow already been to the place where Gaara was enshrined in the Fuinjutsu created by Shinki and left a toad there, and then Ryu and Matsuri found that toad and killed it, the toad being placed there seems almost purposeful. Because remember, after all, who directed Shikamaru to send these shinobi to the Land of Wind in the first place? Kashin Koji. On top of that, it was just explained to us exactly how Boruto's Flying Raijin works. He spreads uniquely shaped items basically anywhere he wants to go, and usually it's the toads holding these uniquely shaped items. So even if this toad was hypothetically killed, the item it was holding on to that would allow for Boruto to teleport directly to it would still be there. So I think in chapter 17, one of the first things that we're going to see is Matsuri and Ryu being connected to Boruto a lot sooner than they anticipated. Because if Gaara, Ayara, and Yodo weren't enough to take on Matsuri alone, then the addition of Mitsuki, Sarada, and Konohamaru isn't going to be enough to get them over the hump of Ryu and Matsuri. And with that, the conclusion of chapter 16 of Two Blue Vortex. Well, this might seem like a setup chapter to some. This chapter not only confirmed tons of theories that we already had, but has also given us a ton to talk about. Like the fact that Jura will not destroy Konoha. The idea that Boruto will at some point pass every single one of his pins out to the people that he loves. This chapter introduced the idea that Jura is stronger than his fellow Shinju by leaps and bounds, but we don't know why. And more than anything, this chapter ended on a cliffhanger that I believe will lead to Boruto popping up between Ryu and Matsuri and starting the fight against the Shinju underlings. And thus, this is by far and away not the last time we're going to be talking about chapter 16 on this channel, ladies and gentlemen. But if there's anything else you want to hear me talk about from this chapter, let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a knot the size of a baseball in my shoulder, and I'm about to go beat the hell out of it.